Ahoy! Joe Buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month, the code is RPG City, and it's good for 10% off orders of $10 or more, running now through Saturday, July 31st. You heard that right, folks. There's plenty of time to cash in this code, RPG City, at Noble Knight Games for 10% off orders of $10 or more, because this promo is running until July 31st. Never been a better time to get back to gaming with your friends. New games, old games, whatever you're looking for, Noble Knight has it, and they're ready to part with it and add it to your collection. So don't forget, when you're checking out at Noble Knight Games, online or in person, RPG City is the code for 10% off orders of $10 or more, running now through Saturday, July 31st. From our friends over at Noble Knight Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. He's currently icing his fingers, Stu Horvath.
It wasn't really as bad as all that, but
I mean, you know, there is a very specific reason for that, and that's actually what we're going to cover this episode. Stu, you wrote a book.
I wrote a book. There were points where I just didn't think that it was ever going to be done. I just kept writing, and it just didn't seem to be making any forward progress. So now that it's done, I don't know. I feel weird.
Yeah, it feels like you just let go of something that has been weighing you down for literally months. I mean, how long ago did you start writing this book?
It's hard to say. I definitely started sometime in October, but there were large gaps. It was really hard to get going and going at a consistent pace. I feel like October to December was sort of a lot of starting and stopping. I feel like it really started writing in January.
Okay, so for our listeners at home who might not be fully involved in this inside baseball conversation, Stu, who many of you know from the Vintage RPG Instagram feed, has actually taken it a step further, and he wrote a book, working title, Experience Points. So why don't you tell our listeners, Stu, a little bit about what you put into this book?
Geez, yeah, this is good practice, because I guess people are going to start asking me this a lot, huh?
It's going to be a thing.
Yeah. It's like the next year and a half of my life. Yeah, so it's sort of a history of role-playing games, but it's filtered through how we play them. And the idea is to sort of push past D&D and get at products and books that have sort of expanded the overall vocabulary of tabletop role-playing. I'm uncomfortable with the word history because I feel like that has a scholarly feel to it, and this is very much filtered through my personal experiences and my anecdotal beliefs, and sort of just this podcast is your pal Stu talking about role-playing games. So is the book. It's just me kind of being a little bit more formal, trying to draw connections between books and the games, how they've developed over the decades.
And this is a natural move, I think, because you started with the Instagram, which has been how many years now?
I think I started in 2017, so a lot of years. 4 years.
And we're coming up on 3 years for this podcast.
Yeah.
So the book seems like a natural extension of what you've been doing for the last 4 years and what we've been doing now for 3. You know, there's only so much time we can chat. And yes, I know, dear listeners, some of you would like us to chat longer. We're really not that funny past 20 minutes, and there's only so many words you could cram into an Instagram description and not just be letting people drink through a fire hose. So something like this seems like the right kind of move, because there is so much more to tell behind the stories of role-playing. And you're right, not in a scholarly, this is a history book kind of way. I don't really know that history actually lends itself to a game that's so creative. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
As obnoxious as it often is, I think that part of the appeal of role-playing games is sort of the arguments that people get into about them. Just like anything else, what's the best horror movie, Hambone? And then we arm wrestle over it at the end of the night. And you're going to read the book, and nobody's going to agree with me 100%. And that's going to be kind of fun and awesome. Just don't send me hate mail. But, it's sort of like a one-sided conversation. I'm gabbing, and y'all can kind of yell at the book. The next time I see you or talk to you on the feeds or whatnot, you can tell me what the book said back to you. I don't know. It might get weird. Who knows? It is definitely a natural growth from the Instagram. I always sort of like thought the Instagram was sort of like a notebook for some sort of larger project. So you're going to see some of the material winds up back in the book, much, much more expanded though. It's 166 chapters, definitely 166 main games, and a lot more are mentioned. It's 170,000 words.
That's a lot of words, man.
Yeah, it's 10,000 shy of Cloud Atlas. I'm using that as my benchmark because I happened to rereading Cloud Atlas this winter. And and I was just sort of like, I wonder, this is a long book. It's taking me a long time to read. I wonder how many words it is. And it's about 180,000. So by the time this whole thing is done, I'm tying Cloud Atlas. The main writing is done, but there's so much more to do. There's like an introduction to write and like revision, and I'm going to add some chapters. And these things take forever,
Yeah, and definitely, in our Patreon feed, I know there's people who've been weighing in about chapters that you said you've cut and that you're going to try to possibly lead back into it. One of the things that I think stands out to me for the work that you've been doing on it, because dear listener, I mean, we're friends outside of this podcast. We're pretty much neighbors at this point. So, I have been around Stu during this writing process for a long time. And one of the things that I think really stood out to me was that you didn't really focus too much on Dungeons and Dragons, which does have the specter for over 4 decades looming larger than any other game ever made on our planet. So why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about your methodology behind moving to literally every other game out there and not so much focusing on just the big one?
So it's impossible, right? Like you can't not talk about Dungeons and Dragons. It's the first game. It's the biggest, obviously. But there's all sorts of things that have happened over the course of this. Like it's not that great a game in a lot of ways. Like I love Dungeons and Dragons, don't get me wrong, but like it definitely has had more ups and downs than people are willing to admit to, or they kind of block stuff out. There's all sorts of like little controversies that happen. And back in second edition, people accused it of being like a horrifically bloated game that was like mostly cash grabs. And then they said the same thing about third edition. And then like, the people who hate fifth edition are saying that they haven't done D&D right since third edition. And they're the same people that often were complaining back in third edition days of too many books being out. It's just so many other people have told that story. So many people play it. So many people have witnessed Dungeons and Dragons over the years. It's like a catechism in church. Like who cares about Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson anymore? Like they're important, sure, but like they're important in a very specific way. And other people have told those stories. So like, I don't need to do it. So I just kind of moved past it, dealt with as many things as I felt I could get away with. And there's no getting around the fact that it's important to the larger history. What TSR did, and that's when most of the D&D stuff happens. I don't really cover it so much after Wizards of the Coast buys it. So there's a lot of innovation that happens elsewhere in the industry that TSR sort of takes and crystallizes or refines and popularizes. I find that outside of the initial, creation of the whole type of game, I don't really see TSR innovating so much as sort of solidifying stuff that other people have kind of like brought innovation to. And you can kind of like get the important books and publications out of the way and then make way for a whole bunch of other stuff.
Well, it's a thread that does run through the entire history of role-playing games, because you have D&D, which is the first, and it's a tree that bears fruit. And that fruit often falls from the tree, and then people take it and run with it and create their own cool games. So yeah, you can't talk about RPGs and the idea of the world of RPGs without talking about the big one. Some would say the GOAT. However, nowadays there's a lot of smaller books out there that are doing some really cool and interesting stuff and have been doing cool and interesting stuff for decades. So why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about how the book's broken up? Because obviously it's not just going to be a glut of information and just pictures of cool stuff that you bought from Noble Knight Games. Shameless plug.
It's separated by decade. I felt like that was the easiest way to sort of organize it. The original idea was to sort of do a more big chapters that were sort of thematically linked. So there would be like a chapter on dungeons and a chapter on hex crawls and a chapter on like campaign settings. And I could have done that, but the book really sort of started to make sense when I got rid of that idea and divided everything by decades and then arranged products in sort of a semi-chronological order. It's hard to track down exactly when a lot of books came out, relative to each other in a year, but stuff is arranged by year in sort of a way that makes sense. And it's cool because there's like these thematic and narrative threads that actually kind of play out in interesting ways that way. Like chronological, you think is sort of like the most boring way to organize something, but in this case, it just works really well. And there's a really clear middle point in the history of role-playing games from where we are right now. And on either side of that middle point are really interesting bookends that have sort of like cropped up. So in just in terms of design philosophy and things kind of pinging back and forth, like there's just cool stuff interrelated throughout the whole history that's surprising. And when I was a kid, there was these history books. It's like the history of the world. Will Durant pointed out what was going on elsewhere at the same time. So like my mind was kind of blown that like Christopher Columbus was doing his thing while the Renaissance was going on. Like, because usually, my grade school curriculum, you did Christopher Columbus, and that was like a thing that you did that was totally separate from like, European history. I never really connected those things until later. And just like, I think that maybe Confucius was around at the same time. So you could kind of like seeing everything in position next to each other. And the same thing sort of happens in this book where it's just like, wait, that book was out at the same time? Like Planescape came after World of Darkness? That's weird. And putting it there, like I love Planescape. There's nothing that's going to make me ever not like Planescape.
Maybe if they put it out for 5th edition, but I'm just spitballing there.
Hey, now World of Darkness is so edgy in comparison that like it kind of makes Planescape feel washed out, even though like I love it. And it's sort of like, TSR's take on Nine Inch Nails, which is sort of why I love it. But like Vampire the Masquerade is just like so like goth and punk and industrial 4 years earlier. So like seeing that kind of stuff, you just kind of get a sense for the vibe of things in a way that you don't, especially if you limit it to like an Arcana where you're just looking at Dungeons and Dragons. I love Chaosium products, but I think that the same thing would happen if I did a book that was just a history of Chaosium. You would kind of lose this sense of like a larger industry and the trends and currents within it.
Well, the world is so much bigger than just the town you live in, right?
Yeah.
I think from what you're saying to me, that's kind of what I'm getting from this, which is if you look at just Dungeons and Dragons, the whole world outside of it is bold and new, but you would never know because you're just nose to the grindstone on D&D.
Yeah.
Could be said the same thing for Chaosium. Whereas, chronological is not a bad thing. The only time chronological doesn't really work for me is if it's in reverse chronological order and I'm going to see the Damned on their 40th anniversary tour and I have to wait 3 hours to hear New Rose. But I digress. Chronological's, I think, a great move, especially when you're tying the thread and the narrative running through those decades, because this will lead to this and then that will lead to that. But you kind of need to see the path that it goes on. So, I mean, I think that's cool.
Yeah. And another thing, like a lot of people want to put that comic book idea of like ages onto role-playing games and say that like the birth decade, the 70s was the golden age. And like that the 80s was somehow a silver age. And then the 90s was like, I don't know, bronze age.
Whatever a rusted penny is, but go on.
I feel like there is already sort of like a natural break in the decades. Like they feel thematically complete in a way that ages seems both besides the point and like too much of a point. I just question anybody who honestly believes that the 70s was a golden age, especially if you look around now. Like there's so many more products made by so many different kinds of people right now. There's just an infinite variety of games on the market right now. The 70s was 6 years of D&D clones. And I'm saying that loving games like, RuneQuest or Bunnies and Burrows. As wild as Bunnies and Burrows is, it's still D&D by a different name. I hope that the book kind of puts truth to that kind of lie that the good old days were somehow perfect and good or monolithic too. A lot of people over and over again, like you hear about like back in the day, this is the way things were played. But it's just like there was no unified role-playing experience back in the 70s. It varied table by table. And the only time you got a sense of a bigger community was if you could go to a convention. And that was hard to do in the 70s and 80s. And a lot of stuff was kept super regional. Anytime you hear somebody say back in the day, it was this and says something absolute, I can guarantee you that person is absolutely wrong. And again, I hope that people can read the book and kind of see why that's wrong. The whole hobby comes out of this notion that D&D was broken when it was released. So a whole bunch of people tried to fix it. Instantly, 1974, D&D comes out. People are like, wow, this game would be really interesting if I knew how to play it. So this must be broken. Let's try and fix it. That's how the whole industry starts.
It's kind of amazing. The moment of inception actually launched 1,000 ships at the same time.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the Big Bang, and then suddenly everyone's like, oh, wait, we can do it better. And then they just run off in all their different directions. And Experience Points really does show you those directions and bring it back together. You know, I often think that when people say that something was a golden age, it just means that they haven't done anything fun or cool since then. Because
there's a truth to that.
Because look at it. I mean, I hear people, when I was a kid, I had to do this. It's just like, well, piss off. I don't want to do that. Why do I want to suffer? Like, why would you want to remember suffering? Like, why not continue to have fun?
Yeah.
You know, I grew up in the 80s and in the early 90s. I was like a teenager. So, I saw all the greats in the theaters from the 80s, you know, most of them, because I couldn't like sneak into R-rated movies yet because I was like, not old enough to ride that ride, but I saw everything. And yet I don't think that, nothing else good is ever going to happen or come out again. The best is yet to come. The golden age is right now. The golden age is whenever you get to a gaming table with your friends. It still happens. You just got to not worry about that time you had to walk backwards to school in the snow uphill in socks.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't want to diminish anybody's experiences. I'm sure that playing D&D at the table in like the wood panel basement in the 70s was awesome. I think
that's sexy.
I have such a deep fascination for that stuff, and the 80s was a different vibe, and like I'm sure it was like cool playing. Like I was like, a kid in the 80s playing D&D. So like I'm sure it was like a completely different experience for teenagers in New Jersey. It was all fun and exciting, but like favor that or my own experiences over anybody else's or any other period. And I think there's an objective truth here. I think that like there's just so much interesting stuff going on right now because the hobby is so much bigger and diverse than it used to be. Like I'm hard pressed to believe that the hermetically sealed 70s is somehow superior. There was only a handful of games and they were all like typewritten, typewritten photocopies.
And there's nothing more punk rock than that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's awesome, but it's also not awesome. I also like offset printing and like inexpensive digital desktop printing software.
And buying things complete aftermarket. I get it.
Yeah.
So this was a little bit of a different episode, dear listener, because I'm psyched for my friend. My friend wrote a book, and I think it's the coolest thing in the world. And I wanted to talk a little bit about it because it's a huge deal. It's not the first thing that Stu's written. He did The Rooms, which was a choose your own adventure. The Hag of Blackwoods, which is a D&D adventure that we played many, many, many years ago. And, this is the first of this style of book that Stu's ever done. So, I'm proud of you, man. I'm psyched for you. I'm happy for you. So next week we will be back to the normal to and fro that we do about classic books and new games. But this week I wanted to talk about this book. So you are going to kickstart this at some point in the fall, right? Because you just finished the first run writing the damn thing. Now you got to go back to, all the other stuff involved. Yeah.
So I gotta shoot like 250 photos and we got to get it edited, and which 250 photos sounds crazy, but that's literally a week and a half's worth of work. That part's easy. I'm looking forward to that because I get to like go through my shelves again
with a cup of coffee, putting on a Warren Zevon album and just snapping photos of your favorite thing in the world. Oh, how terrible, Stu.
Yeah. When is really a matter of, I hope I'm not talking out of school, but Matt's decision. I want to get as much as is humanly possible done with the book and kickstart it as quickly as possible so that we could fulfill it as quickly as possible. So like those are the factors, but timing is
everything.
So, and I'm not even settled on the title. Experience Points was the working title, and my wife Daisy asked our son Jer, who was like 3.5, what he thought of the title, and he was just like, Experience Points is garbage.
From the mouths of babes, everybody.
Yeah. So if you have different ideas, I'm all ears because I've already disappointed my son. A couple days later, he was just like randomly like walked by and was just like, "Dad," and I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "You're nothing." It's like, Jesus Christ.
What kind of Peppa Pig shit is that? I know they didn't teach that on PBS, man.
Yeah, man. It's humbling being a dad.
So I've heard. Well, dear listener, we are going to be chatting a little bit more about this as we get closer to the time that Stu is going to be kickstarting it. Experience Points is the working title, but maybe not for much longer. This will be getting kickstarted at some point during the fall with Stu and our friends over at Exalted Funeral. I'm excited for them about this. With that being said, we're going to wrap this episode up. Next week, we will be back to the normal style of chit chat that you're used to. In the meantime, Stu, where can the people find you?
You can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, posting daily about role-playing games other than D&D and D&D too. I mean, come on, we got to throw him a bone, right?
Yeah, of course. You know, what will Daddy Hasbro do without those clicks? You could find me on Instagram at John McGuire RPG. I've actually been posting more lately. I just rediscovered the CU George studio sessions from the Life Aquatic. So I just put some stuff about that up on my Instagram stories. Sometimes I go on Twitter. Probably not, though, but you can also find me there at John McGuire RPG. If you love the show, don't forget to check out our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got early release episodes. We've got a behind the scenes look that's been going on for months for Stu's book. We have a behind the scenes look on my RPG 321 Action First Adventure Rocket to Russia is almost going to press. We're pretty pumped about that. You also have a killer Discord community that we'd love for you to be a part of, patreon.com/vintagerpg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dego West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.